Number 12, the Citadel. Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak's premier map is an absolute Goliath of a hunting ground, which contains some of my favorite art direction in the game, and handles having multiple biomes pretty damn well. The Citadel certainly gets a lot of ambition points, but what issues there are is why this one's only at number 12. The Citadel features a ruined castle town built off to the side of an alpine forest at the foot of a snow-covered mountain range, and incorporates all three of these regions into its battle zones. This is probably the most fun map to explore in Rise, and makes excellent use of the game's want for you to go outside of the traditional paths and fight arenas to explore the stuff in between. There's a moat to run along, a sewer system to delve into, an old mine shaft to descend, ruined remains of an old settlement to walk around, scattered towers along the mountainside, and castle walls to run up to. If you're a big fan of how Rise handles its locale design and implements the wirebug system into traversal, I think the Citadel is going to be one of your all-time favorite locales in this series. I think the Citadel also establishes an incredible atmosphere. The scattered and disheveled ruins of the old, lonely settlements now overrun by nature and powerful monsters creates this feeling of an ancient tragedy, whilst the power of nature overrules the strength of man. There is a persistent sense of hostility at the Citadel that feels very fitting for a Master Rank exclusive map. There also exists a soft, fantastical element to the place that doesn't divorce itself too much from Monster Hunter's more grounded tendencies. The ruined main citadel stands as the nest of the vampiric Malzeno. This, combined with the dense, dangerous forests and wind-swept snowy mountains and ominous purple glow from the moon at night, creates this kind of dark fairy tale feel that helps the Citadel stand out. It can be a hauntingly gorgeous map to just stop and look at. For instance, once you leave base camp, your camera is perfectly angled to see a beautiful shot of the old ruined castle against the towering mountains in the background. I do have a few minor criticisms about the art direction though. For one, though I adore the dark whimsy of the map's atmosphere, holy crap, this map gets really, really purple at night. Like, noticeably, obnoxiously purple. I get the vibe it's going for, but sometimes the lighting feels a little too fantasy-esque, especially when it's reflecting off of all the snow and ice. The other issue I have with the color here is kind of ironic, actually. I think the green is a tad too lush and beautiful in a couple places. The grass and the trees here look great, undoubtedly, especially considering the fact that Rise dropped the ball pretty bad in the color department when it came to its more forest dedicated maps. The Shrine Ruins and Flooded Forest are stuck with pretty uncharitable gray, brown, green mush color palettes. Alternatively, the greens for the Citadel look great, almost a little too green and saturated though. The forest sections here are a few dozen feet away from snowy mountain regions, and they look maybe just like a little too green for that kind of proximity. What I can say positively about the forest or snow sections of this map is the gradual transition between the two. The more southern part of the map has a lot of bright green, and then gradually the trees will start to have less and less leaves. The grass clusters will start to get smaller and further apart. Eventually the grass and dirt starts to give way more to stone with a little bit of moss mixed in. Then the small piles of snow start to form. The grass patches start to look a little bit more dead, and then you get to the areas where the zone turns into just full-on ice and snow completely. The slow process of the biomes changing across the battle zones from south to north is pretty sick to observe, honestly. It may not be super realistic distance-wise, but I think the execution is rather well done considering the limitations of Monster Hunter map size. Gameplay-wise, the Citadel is also very solid. In terms of interactable elements, it has a few destructible towers, trees containing poisonous fluids that can be poured over the battlefield, a few areas with some good vertical ledges to play around with, and a very unique sap-filled swamp that can extend the time that a knockdown monster stays on the ground. I also definitely enjoy the majority of the battle zones that the map has to offer. 14 and 17 are tight and intimate boss arenas that the Elder Dragons frequent. They have just enough space to be fun to fight in, while also being a teeny bit claustrophobic, which results in some really tense duels between you and the bigger, faster elders. Areas like 2, 4, 8, 10, and 13 are nice and spacious, with some of them containing the interactable hazards I talked about earlier. Area 5 has some fun verticality to play around with. Area 1 can be a pretty cool scenic place to battle since you have the silhouette of the castle as a backdrop for whatever you're facing. There's also an appreciated spiderweb of connecting pathways that makes map traversal incredibly easy and efficient. There are, however, a few zones that I don't love. 6 feels like a midsection in a hallway that was just fattened up a little bit to make a pretty unimpressive battle zone. 3 has a wall jutting in at a harsh angle that can make it kind of annoying to deal with if you have your back facing to it. Despite the massive size of this map though, the vast majority of its combat zones do see regular usage, which is always appreciated. This is absolutely due to the gargantuan roster of monsters that can be found here. Now, this map's potential bestiary is another point of mild contention for me. The Citadel region is kind of marketed as this hyper-competitive area that's home to particularly powerful monsters. So they stuck in an absolute ton of just higher tier bosses in this map. What this does is make the Citadel a tad less interesting than other maps in terms of wildlife due to the fact that it lacks the more structured hierarchy of animals that 5th generation Monster Hunter maps usually pride themselves on. Also, there's a few monsters here like Volvodon, Blood Orange Bishaten, and Pyrarachna that just feel absolutely out of place here. I have no idea what they're doing on this map. So, since this is a battleground of absolute powerhouses, what that does mean is that many of the absolute best fights in Sunbreak can be waged here, and you're typically just gonna have a lot of fun fighting at the Citadel because of that fact. My point is that the Citadel can sometimes be a little bit reduced to the Elder Dragon and Flagship map. And the only other thing I'd have to say about the Citadel is that I kind of wish the castle ruin part of the map had a few more destructible castle town elements in the actual battle zones, and that the majority of the buildings weren't just sequestered behind walls that the monsters couldn't access. It could be really fun to destroy an old ruined town in a battle with a Malzeno or something like that. Might have been a bit beyond the expansion scope though, I don't know. The Citadel is one of the most ambitious maps that Monster Hunter has ever had, and I think its execution is flawed, but commendable. The majority of it is fun to fight on, it is a blast to explore, it has a huge roster of excellent fights, it makes effective use of its gargantuan size, and I think it handles its 3 biomes rather well. I do think the monster roster is a tad top-heavy, I think there's a little bit oversaturation, and there's a couple of zones I don't love, but I am overall impressed with the results here. You find yourself on the Citadel a lot in Sunbreak, and that was almost never something to complain about. Number 11. The Old Swamp. Now this is a surprise. What on earth is a first-generation Monster Hunter map doing on this list and above the Citadel? Like I said when I introduced this project, when comparing the maps of the different generations, the context of the era they were made in matters. The 5th generation maps have the potential to be massively more impressive if they manage to expertly balance their more modern mechanics, and they make their battle zones feel varied and diverse despite their seamlessness. This means that these maps also have a lot more that they can potentially get wrong. A map like Monster Hunter 1's Old Swamp certainly can't be as experimental as a locale coming out today, but I think it's a map that absolutely outdoes its contemporaries and even many of its immediate successors in terms of art direction, map layout, atmosphere, and uniqueness. The first thing anybody is going to bring up when discussing Monster Hunter 1's Old Swamp is its haunting and almost sinister tone in a few select zones, those being the base camp and areas 1, 2, 4, and 9. Over these zones lies a dense purple haze that paints them with a surreal and spooky feeling. Kind of funny that we have 2 maps back to back on this list that use the color purple in their skybox to create a dark and gothic atmosphere. With the Old Swamp though, the less intense saturation and vision obscuring fog honestly do a better job of establishing this mood, despite the Citadel's newer technology. Simply put, the misty regions of the Old Swamp feel far less cartoon scary, which is not inherently a bad thing, and instead feel more organically eerie with a hint of fantastical whimsy due to the violet coloration. Area 1 even has this tranquil yet ethereal piece of ambient music to it. Apparently, Capcom even just swiped this piece to use it again and stuck it in Resident Evil 4. I wish all of these purple mist zones had this track playing in the background when there isn't any ongoing combat. I think using this piece would only further solidify the desired tone of this locale and would make it feel just that little extra bit more special, too. The rest of this locale has assets and design elements that you're going to recognize from the swamp map of the second generations, or the marshlands as it's called in Monster Hunter Generations, which is probably the swamp map that you're the most familiar with. Both maps have similar swampy gray ground, huge puddles, scattered vegetation, dead and withering trees, long wavy fields of wild grass, and dark icy caves. Only the old swamp is way more interesting to look at and has far superior colors. For some reason, the marshlands infuses basically everything with a really dull-looking gray, especially the plant life and the mud. In the old swamp, the grayness doesn't exist quite to that extent in these elements. The ground and the map walls have a much harsher kind of charcoal gray color to them, and the trees and plants have some much more lively, yet still deep and dark shades of green. The more light gray color exists, but mostly just in the skybox, and this creates a way nicer color contrast across all the map's elements. The marshlands sometimes just kind of blends into one big gray ball of sludge, whereas the old swamp looks a lot more sharp. The old swamp simply makes better use of its assets, too. Zones are littered with these slim, leafless trees that make for minor obstacles in some of the battle zones without being particularly annoying. The caves have tons of tree roots dangling from the ceiling and these huge, multicolored ice crystal formations that sometimes let off this little extra bit of lighting. There is an appropriate density of cool stuff to look at peppered within the zones and in the backgrounds. Another big reason I like this map quite a bit is its traversal is pretty solid. A lot of classic maps can sometimes struggle with zone layouts that are simply obnoxious to run around. This can be due to maps having zones that are obnoxiously large, with transition points being placed very far away from each other, maps that have a ton of vertical traversal and zones that are very far from camp, and maps that lack enough zones that serve as hubs connecting to various other points on the same location. The old swamp manages its layout pretty damn well. Areas 2, 4, 5, 6, 9, and 10 all have connection points to at least 3 other zones, and the entire map is essentially 2 interlinked circles with a couple of straggler zones at the corners. Finding and pursuing monsters on this map was not all that much of a hassle, and the only obnoxiously large zone is 3, which is a little out of the way and doesn't often need to be entered for non-combat reasons. The worst thing about the layout for the old swamp is that all 3 of the cave sections are scattered and disconnected. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be an issue if it wasn't for the fact that you need hot drinks to conserve your stamina in all of these sections. So, hypothetically, if a battle lasted long enough and you were fighting in and out of these caves a couple of times, individual hot drinks are going to be used way less efficiently, and you're likely going to spend several minutes in zones where the effect is there, but not doing anything for you, and then you got to take another one a little later on, etc., etc. This is one of the few ways the marshland succeeds over its predecessor. It has one large, interconnected, multi-zone cave section, and if a monster enters those caves, there's a half-decent chance it's going to utilize several cave zones at a time. My only other gripe with the old swamp is that there's a few odd inclusions and exclusions for its monster roster. In what was likely a bid to differentiate the old swamp's cast of monsters from the marshlands, Buldrome, Kongolala, Yankutku, and Chameleos are all not present, and instead you have things like all 3 variations of Rathalos, as well as Nargacuga, which can be fought here. I understand the need to keep the 2 maps different in terms of their roster, but I kind of feel like, I don't know, Hypnocatrice and Yangaruga would have probably made more sense than Rathalos on this map, and why on earth is Chameleos not here? He would be perfect for those purple fog zones. I don't know how they messed that one up. I think the old swamp, though imperfect, embodies the best elements of the original generation of Monster Hunter's locale design. It is steeped in a dreary, somber, hostile atmosphere. It makes excellent use of the limited assets and biome types that it had, and it has far better traversal than the majority of other maps of its era. And the creative and unique elements that it does have, despite Monster Hunter's limitations at the time, have made it probably the second most iconic of the original generation's locales. And in terms of gameplay and structure, it beats the snot out of the much more well-known forest and hills. It also beats the snot out of the follow-up Marshlands map from 2nd generation, as well as, honestly, I think most of the first 2 generations of Monster Hunter's locales. There's only one other from this era that I think is better than the old swamp, but we'll get there a little later down the line. I think this is an absolute classic that deserves to be hunted on by more people. Number 10, the Rotten Vale. Probably the single wildest concept for a map they have ever concocted is this festering labyrinth of corpses and bones. The Rotten Vale is the graveyard for life in the New World. Elder dragons across the planets seem to have an instinct to come here at the time of their death. Some of the battle zones of the Vale are just chunks of absolutely colossal dead Dalamadur. The Rotten Vale is a pivotal piece of world building within Monster Hunter World. It is the macabre end for life before it is recycled into the bioenergies that fuel the continents. It fits beautifully with the themes of life, death, and rebirth, and the natural cycles of nature that this game delved into. In the Rotten Vale's case, it is most certainly the embodiment of death. And yet life remains all the same. The denizens of the Rotten Vale are fascinating animals that I find to be expertly crafted to survive in what should be an absolutely unsurvivable part of the continent. In fact, the only issues I have with the Rotten Vale's monster roster is that the animals here are so specialized that it's going to be a bit tough to bring them back into new games. Also, there aren't exactly a ton of monsters built for the Vale specifically, and next to no monsters designed for other maps would fit in particularly well here. So, in Iceborne, the Rotten Vale can find itself a little cluttered up with an abundance of nomadic invader monsters that the game just throws at every map. What was crafted for the Rotten Vale is exceptional, though. The Gyros are opportunistic little sneaks that will paralyze and eviscerate anything and everything that shows even a remote sign of weakness. Radoban is a Goliath of a brute wyvern that uses tar and the unlimited supply of monster bones in the area to create a suit of spiny battle armor for himself. The Odogaron is a violent savage that embodies the Rotten Vale's hostilities and will attempt to kill just about anything that moves. The acidic Glavenus weaponizes the acids created by the Rotten Vale to coat its tail in an armor-corroding crystal formation. And Valhazak, the Lord of the Rotten Vale, helps to maintain and control the Vale's population of biodegrading bacteria called effluvium. The denizens of the Vale are incredibly well designed for the grotesque nature of their homeland. Artistically, there certainly are more diverse maps out there. The Rotten Vale is almost exclusively a giant pile of corpses, but the Rotten Vale manages to execute its core concept very well and get some decent mileage out of it. The entire map is absolutely drenched in bones and carrion. The upper levels being exposed to sunlight and the lower levels being predominantly covered in cave ceilings does create some distinct contrast between these two sections, though. The darkness of the Vale's depths creates a more oppressive tone, which makes the upper regions seem far less grim simply by comparison. However, there is some beauty way down deep in the very bottom of the Vale. A separate set of caverns which opens up into chambers illuminated by pools of glowing blue acidic liquid. It is an odd slice of deadly gorgeousness that can be found glimmering at the bottom of this graveyard. And if one treks all the way into the deepest regions of these caves, they will find a chamber lit up in a hellish red, which illuminates a mountain of corpses, where Valhazak rules the Vale from. I think what the Rotten Vale ultimately excels at the best in is its lighting. There are a lot of regions that are a tad samey, for sure, but the darker and darker the map gets as it descends, only for the light of the sun to then eventually be replaced by this bizarre alien glow, grants the place a satisfying sense of progression and intrigue. The gameplay here is also pretty solid. The upper regions have some ledge-dotted zones, droppable Dalamadur fangs, and a few areas with netting that monsters can get snared in or use to cause AoE quakes. The lower regions of the Vale focus more heavily on their damage over time effects. The health-draining effluvia covers pretty much the entirety of the bottom of the Vale, minus the acid caves. Thankfully, there are tons of flame pods scattered around the place to disperse the effluvia, and the radius and duration of this dispersal is pretty solid. Fighting in these zones really isn't all that much of a hazard. It just takes a very quick interaction to get rid of the issue. I'm personally a fan of map interactions like this, since you really don't have to jump through too many obnoxious hoops to deal with this kind of problem. The acid pools at the bottom of the Vale have much harsher damage over time, which actually makes for a really fun risk-reward area in Zone 12, where there's some jumping attack ledges that sit right over an acid pool. Those jumping attacks are very easy to land, but you're likely going right in the acid afterwards. There's some more droppable Dalamador fangs down here, and Valhazak's entire corpse mountain is pretty much just one giant sliding zone to fight on, but it also provides the coolness factor of fighting a big boss dragon atop a huge cinematic elevated corpse pile. I am also a fan of the mixture of jumps and slides and valley-like structure of Area 5. It's super fun to fight monsters in the jaws of a Dalamador skull in Area 4. I enjoy the mixture of monster trapping vines and one continuous ledge in Area 2. It can be a ton of fun to fight Odogaron in Zone 10, where there's a pit you have to maneuver around. He's got a ton of walls he can jump off of, and you also have these paratoads and aggro-breaking shrubs that you can use to your advantage. The corpse slide in Zone 9 is pretty fun to fight on. Other zones like 1, 7, and 8 are all perfectly serviceable as well. I think Odogaron's nest is kinda obnoxiously small, but he never lives long enough to use it anyway, so that's not really a problem. The biggest issue with the battle zones is that the entire top area of the map is criminally underused. Before Iceborne came out, you only really could fight Radoban up there. Tigrex can get up there as well once he was introduced in Iceborne, but he also spends like half of his time downstairs. The monsters who use the upper regions of the Vale the most are invaders like Deviljho, Basilgeuse, Bonboro, and Velkhana. So if you really want to fight in the upper levels of the Vale, you can, but some of these guys are really weird to fight in the Vale, and honestly, this top layer is just criminally underserved by the monsters who are actually designed to be here. I also absolutely would have liked more direct pathways from the top of the Vale to the bottom. There's a few more secretive vines and tunnels and a couple of ledges that can be jumped off of, but only one conventional route down. What's there is fine. The slope is very close to base camp, and you'll likely be following most monsters up and down it anyways, but for reasons like expeditions with no set target and giving the monsters some varied pathing to use, another ramp or set of climbable vines would have been very nice here. And the music absolutely deserves a mention as well. This track is crazy good. It's not nearly as grim or despair-filled as a Valley of the Dead would imply, though. It honestly seems to lean way more into the mystery and intrigue that such a place would conjure in the imagination. The whole track is driven by these insanely heavy drums, which I'd say shows how deep down beneath the rest of the world this place is. There's a bizarre and alien yet kind of welcoming use of what I'm pretty sure is a synthesizer to start the track off before the brass comes blaring in with the percussion under it. A flute soloist then leads into an enormous swell of horns and strings, which creates an incredibly beautiful sense of adventure, whilst not abandoning the darker feeling of the Vale. And that is the Rotten Vale. To this day, the most out there map concept that Monster Hunter has ever pulled off. I'm interested to see if Wilds will make an attempt to top it. It's a map that suffers from success a little. It's so specialized that its dedicated monster roster is rather small. Chunks of it go lightly used, outsider monsters don't really seem to fit here, and those that can enter the Vale almost only go there because they can go to every map in the game. It has a great grab bag of gimmicks and combat zones, zones, a fascinating part of the New World's life cycle, a brilliant score, and some excellent progression of lighting and atmosphere as you delve further and further down. I don't think this one will ever be forgotten. Number 9. The Jungle from Monster Hunter DOS. I don't think you could have executed an adventure to a jungle island in Monster Hunter better than this map did. This map is so good that even its very well executed remake in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak couldn't beat it. This place feels dense and mysterious, as well as lively, vibrant, and inviting. Sure, the denizens of the jungle can be dangerous, but the map itself doesn't really have its own hostile edge to it. I think it helps that this is the first map we have on the top 12 with a bright blue skybox to light the entire place up. But you also have this nice looking soft white sand, a great mixture of darker and lighter greens for the plant life. The water is a lovely looking shade of crystal blue, and much of the stone and dirt work here isn't shaded in too dark. It's generally just a pleasant map to look at and run around in. Even the cave system in the heart of the mountain isn't really that dank or dreary looking. There's numerous places where natural light comes spilling into these caves. Simply put, I enjoy being here. I think it's a really fun and almost kind of relaxing backdrop to fight monsters on. Probably has something to do with all the cooler colors. Less relaxing, but not unfitting, is the locale's music. It starts out driven by this very fast-paced percussion rhythm. There's a little bit of vocalization in there to kind of set a more tribal tone. All while the horns and strings gradually build on themselves, getting louder and more intense until the horns just start blaring out the main melody of the track. This section is then given a lot of drive and sense of danger by these shrill sounding strings repeatedly hitting on quarter notes. It's an awesome battle track, as well as a very fitting piece of music for the vibe of an ancient jungle. It's one of those really great map tracks that I don't think gets talked about enough. I think the sense of urgency and speed that the percussion and the strings give are legitimately invigorating to listen to. Then we have another pretty solid collection of battle zones here as well. Not the most diverse in terms of scenery and locations, but I think it gets the job done with what a jungle can offer. Zones 1, part of 3, and 9 use the dense foliage of a jungle pretty well. Areas 2 and 5 are these elevated low foliage platforms that grant nice big open backdrops to your battles with the monsters. Areas 4, 3, and 10 offer up these big slices of coastline to fight aquatic monsters on, and then 6, 7, and 8 make up a pretty solid cave section in the depths of the mountain that serves as the locale's centerpiece. Almost all of these zones are pretty fun to fight on too. Generally pretty spacious, with the exception of Area 1 being pretty lightly used. They all get some solid mileage from a variety of different monsters. Area 4 is a bit obnoxiously narrow though, especially if you have something like Plesioth spending half of its time there. It also has these 2 divots that you can kind of easily get stuffed into and then corner trapped in. Area 9 can also be a little obnoxious in places. It's got this really narrow choke point that monsters love to make use of. Traversal on this map is pretty solid. It's mostly just a 4-zone ring with a bunch of stuff in the middle. Area 3 also makes for a very nice reset zone for tracking monsters on, since it connects to 5 other battle zones and can more or less take you anywhere you want to go within only like a zone or 2. I will say, and this isn't necessarily the map's fault, I have some aggravating memories of this place, since it can be home to a lot of flying monsters. And they can go to pretty much any battle zone they want to from any location that they want to. Not remembering spawn locations or forgetting a paintball in this place has resulted in a few 3 to 5 minute wild goose chases. Another major strength of this map is that it has reappeared so many times now that it has a pretty gargantuan roster of monsters that can go here, and the entire list is really solid and makes sense. The presence of caverns, beaches, wyvern nests, high altitude perches, and dense jungles have made it so that a huge chunk of the bestiary has a reason to be here. The jungle is a phenomenal classical map with a ton of mileage, a winning personality, a great selection of fights and battle zones, and I believe it stands as the absolute best that the original 2 generations of Monster Hunter had to offer in terms of locale design. Mild spoilers for the rest of the list. Number 8, the Sunken Hollow and Volcanic Hollow. So if we're talking about the uniqueness of a map, there is certainly nothing like the Sunken Hollow and the Volcanic Hollow. These are locales with the exact same layout, since they're the same geographic location. The difference is that the flow, or lack of flow, of molten lava results in enormous changes to atmosphere, color palettes, and monster variety. The typical reason why there's a disparity here is because this cave system was actually carved out by the lava flow from a nearby volcano, and the Sunken Hollow is what the place looks like when said volcano is dormant. However, there's an added story context to this disparity within the events of Monster Hunter 4. In the particular point in time in which you go to this region, a Nursula has used its webbing to block off the tunnels that the lava would usually flow from with giant boulders, and the locals need this Temnoceran gone so that they can light up their forges again. Defeating Nursula will unlock quests that swap the Sunken Hollow into the Volcanic Hollow. There is no season or time limit effect in Monster Hunter 4 though, and for the rest of the game you'll just load into whichever version of the map is specified by the accepted quest. So this is kinda sick already. It's a location with a separate variation of itself. Both versions have different tones to them and different monsters who live there. It's a location that was carved out by a separate natural landmark, and there are both ecological and narrative reasons behind the swapping of the 2 states. Monster Hunter doesn't really have anything else quite like that. Even the massive weather events that we're going to be getting in Wilds can't quite impact the maps on the same level that this dual state locale can. The sandstorms of the Windward Plains can certainly alter the behaviors of the animals who live there, but when the volcano near the hollow comes to life, the entire ecosystem of this region changes. Several species will just vacate the Sunken Hollow completely, and a number of more volcanic-oriented animals will then take their place. It's kinda neat to think about the off-screen transition between the 2 states that we don't actually get to see. The different lighting and color for the 2 maps not only do a great job in giving both states of the Hollow different tones, but are also excellently executed individually. The Sunken Hollow uses a huge mixture of shades of brown, gray, tan, yellow, orange, and red to make the place look visually appealing while still being a dark, dank, earthy underground cave system. It's a pretty deceptively colorful place in its own dour sort of way. There are also a few zones with some luminescent fungus and glowing blue pools of water, as well as some plant life on the upper levels to add these extra shocks of color here and there. There's a great mixture of earthy colors on display here, as well as this huge presence of sulfuric yellow to some of the lower regions. Then the Volcanic Hollow takes on a much more simple color palette. It focuses on darker browns and grays that are lit up with a moody and hellish mix of reds, oranges, and yellows. The lava being the chief source of lighting in these caverns means that the tone down here is far more sinister than the sunken variation of this place. And some of the scenic views you can get from the top regions of the Hollow are absolutely apocalyptic. There's a lot of other awesome little bits and pieces around the place too. There's a couple of bogs and mires down in the Hollow, and a couple of large crystal formations, some aforementioned glowing fungal structures, and of course the absolute regional dominance that Nursula holds over the upper regions of the Hollow. Despite only being a lowered mid-level difficulty monster, Nursula feels like she is the top level predator of the Sunken Hollow. She has 3 zones absolutely covered in her spider webs for her to play around around with and utilize her unique methods of fighting and maneuvering around a battlefield. And you absolutely cannot forget one of the most gnarly aspects of visual storytelling that Monster Hunter has to offer. Nursula's nests are littered with the strung up and skinned corpses of Gypsyros, the bird wyvern she uses to craft her protective electricity-resistant cloaks and solidified poison crystals. Unfortunately, since Nursula doesn't stick around when the caverns flood with lava, her zones, and honestly the majority of the upper levels of the Sunken Hollow, go severely underutilized in the volcanic version of the map. And since the Volcanic Hollow is the only version of this map that made its way into Monster Hunter Generations, it feels like a weirdly bloated map in that game, specifically in terms of zone count. I think Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate needed a new fire subspecies or two that could adequately use these big netted areas in the Volcanic Hollow. In fact, why can't Ash Ketchawacha go here? That'd make sense. There probably also maybe needed to be like a fire Nursilla or something. Maybe a different Temnoceran completely for this section. It's too bad Rakna-Kadaki arrived a whole generation too late to help out here. The best you can get with these upper regions of the Volcanic Hollow are versions of Rathalos and Yangaruga. It's not the end of the world, but it's definitely an issue with the map. Most of the volcanic beasts like Uragan, Gravios, Teostra, and Brachydios are just too damn big and heavy to be up on the spider webs and traversing the higher cliffs of the hollows. The Sunken version of this map doesn't really have these issues. It's got Nursilla, Ketchawacha, and Kongalala on the vines and on the webs. The Wraths and a few other flying wyverns can go up into the cliffs, and the caverns and the bogs are all filled with monsters like Kezu, Gypsyros, Tetsukabra, and Gendrome. The music for the Sunken Hollow is pretty solid. It's not super melodic and mostly just uses percussion to drive itself forwards, while using strings and reverb on some of the instruments to create a creepy, echoing element for the place. Sells a battle in a deep, dark, forgotten cavern pretty well, though it's certainly not the most memorable track that Monster Hunter has to offer. The Volcanic Hollow track, on the other hand, kinda stinks. It's super similar to the Sunken version, but it's pitched down and slowed down. The Sunken Hollow track was already not very fast or very high-pitched. This one just feels meandering and plodding. Even the percussion isn't as strong. Wrapping things up with positives though, the battle zones here are pretty high quality across the board. There's plenty of ledges and climbable surfaces and spiderwebs to make use of in just about every area. The only area I don't really like is 3. It's a cave with a huge column in the middle, and it isn't a particularly big zone without that column. It's okay enough when you have something like Gypsyros or Kezu running up that pillar to attack you from the ceiling, but anything bigger than that is going to make the zone annoying really fast. This place does, however, have an excellent massive zone, that being Area 8, which is a highlight specifically for the Volcanic Hollow, and is very often used. It's a great place for fights that need a lot of room to breathe. Things like Tigrex, Deviljho, Glavenus, Ignactor, and Gravios. They're all usually here pretty often too, so it's fun to fight them here. This zone has a lot of great elevation changes so the gameplay doesn't feel dull, and lets the bigger monsters just kinda do their stuff. The Nursula zones 4, 5, and 6 are awesome when you're fighting her there. 2 is a pretty cool area that's a little bit more claustrophobic and intense without being obnoxiously narrow, and Area 9 is a pretty great nest area with tons of destructible rocks that can be turned into hazardous lava pools. There's nothing quite like the Volcanic and Sunken Hollow, and there may never be again. Despite the Sunken Hollow version very much feeling like the more fleshed out state of the map and its absence being felt in Generations, this combo is a memorable standout of Monster Hunter 4. It's got some excellent combat, memorable visual storytelling, and handles two differing sets of color, lighting, and atmosphere expertly despite having the exact same layout on both maps. Cheers to the art department for this one. Number 7. The Ancestral Step. Monster Hunter 4 introduced a lot of new options for players and monsters to utilize in combat. Players could now lunge off ledges to do jumping attacks in an attempt to knock their targets down for huge amounts of damage. Maps were given separate elevation levels and more climbable surfaces. Monsters could use vines and webbing to get around, and there were more destructible elements added to several battle zones. These features served to add an additional layer of dynamism to the combat of Monster Hunter. You weren't fighting monsters in flat circles and boxes anymore. The third dimension of space was now incredibly important, arguably even more so than with underwater combat in Tri. Your awareness of your surroundings matters far more when you can actually interact with objects in this additional third dimension. So Monster Hunter 4 had the challenge of making these new mechanics feel potent and consistent right from the jump, and I'd like to think that it did so pretty magnificently. Let's talk about the combat stuff first. You're almost never going to be fighting in Area 1, and Area 3 isn't used a ton either, admittedly, so you can either go straight to Area 2 or continue through 3 and into Area 8. Area 8 has this triple layer battle zone with a pretty simple and sizable box arena right in the middle right of the map. This pit is surrounded by a second shelf layer that allows for easy jumping attacks in a whole kind of circle around it, and a third layer is placed above the second. Each of these layers are large enough to fight on, and it becomes this game of trying to bait the monster onto the lower shelves so you can hack at it with mounting attacks. Area 2, on the other hand, is pretty spacious with a couple of ledges you can hop on, but its main feature is a second floor suspended over the first one. Not only can you use vines and a staircase towards the back of the map to climb up onto this second floor, but also the monsters can use the vines that make up this second level to swing around and attack you from overhead if you're on the ground, or attack you from under your feet if you're up on that second floor. You can even knock monsters through the vines and send them crashing down to the ground below if you get a solid knockdown on them. Pretty quickly, the Ancestral Step gives you two areas with different types of verticality that encourage strategy and outmaneuvering the monster, while also giving the beasts the ability to use these tools to their advantage as well. I think these two early zones are perfectly set up and positioned to introduce you to how Monster Hunter 4 works. And there's absolutely more to talk about in terms of combat. Area 4 of the Ancestral Step is one of my favorite battle zones in Monster Hunter, period. It's got tons of little ledges and hills and ramps to make the verticality constantly shift and change. It's got this little river if you have to deal with fire blight. It's got this destroyable bridge on top of these big rock piles. That's kind of cool to try and bait the monster into smashing that apart. The bridge can be used for jumping attacks into this little valley down below it. I love fighting flying enemies here and trying to trick them by putting them into positions where I'm above them and getting mounting attacks off of them. It can be super cool to also fight in Area 7, which is this giant, massive, three-tiered cliff face that you gotta climb up. Each platform on this cliff face is big enough to be its own arena, and there's this constant threat of being thrown down a level by the monster as you're battling with it. Area 9 is pretty similar to 2, but its second floor is raised even higher. There's a couple of jumpable gaps on that second floor that you can hop between, and there's a few rock pillars that the monsters can smash into and break apart. Then you got Area 5, which looks like a very typical flying wyvern nest, but it's got a cool twist to it where attacks from monsters like Rathalos can knock the nest off kilter and make you lose your balance. When the Ancestral Step wants to play around with its verticality mechanics, it really plays with them and seems to have a blast doing it. There's a lot of great variety here, and the ingenuity built into these zones can make for some exceptional battles. There are a few zones here that are a little bit less creative, which is absolutely fine, but they're also a little bit underused in terms of the monsters going to them as well. Area 3 only really has one little ledge that's tucked off towards the back, and monsters very rarely go there. Area 1 is pretty much just an introduction zone. If you can fight anything there, I have no memory of it. And Area 6 is another zone that is used pretty sparingly. It's fine enough. It's a little area with the two ledges over a water pool that you can attack from. That's fine. The vast majority of the fighting I have done and can clearly remember in both Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate and Generations Ultimate is in areas 2, 4, 7, and 8. 9 and 5 also get some decent usage too because they're nests, but that's typically during the battle's final minutes. There's a solid percentage of this map that gets some attention, but would absolutely stand to benefit if it received more. I would not be shocked if the developers knew which zones were overtly the more interesting and complex ones and coded the monsters to stick more around that select group. It can at least feel that way. The best of the combat in the Ancestral Steppe is phenomenal, but there's certainly some preferential treatment here and there. The other thing I find phenomenal about the Ancestral Steppe is its art and aesthetics in some areas. I adore the autumnal palette mixed with the huge cliffs of redstone and a wild yellow grassland that this map features. Again, dude, Area 4, it's got these huge red rock structures both on the map and looming out in the background, and then you just have this enormous canopy of gorgeous red leaves covering most of the zone, and then the sunlight comes pouring in through the tree leaves and turns golden in the process. Areas 1 and 3 might not be used very much, but I do love just looking out at the sea of long golden savanna grass that they both use in their zones and in their backgrounds. Unfortunately, the map starts to abandon these gorgeous colors the more you start to climb up the mountain. I guess that makes sense, but some of these lower levels of the steppe are so gorgeous and really different from any other forest and hills-like type of map that Monster Hunter has to offer, and I wish that that was more consistent across the board. I would like if that redstone and the deciduous trees retained at least some level of prominence throughout the entire map. The music's also pretty strong. It's big and it's brassy and has this big sense of bombast and heroism and battle to it. It's not the most intense or adrenaline-pumping music track, though it does have some quieter sections that lean a bit more in that direction. The strongest emotion I get from this piece is triumph, and I think it works excellently as an opening battle track for Monster Hunter 4, which also loves using a lot of enormous heroic brass in its main theme. I have no issues or particularly strong opinions regarding map traversal or monster roster. The monsters here slot in nicely for a woodsy map with a lot of hills and mountains. There's plenty of monkey monsters to swing around in the vines, there's flying and bird wyverns to properly utilize the cliffs, and large predators to use the more broad grassland areas. And it's a pretty meaty roster with beasts at just about every tier of difficulty. No elder dragons though, oddly enough. And moving around this map isn't too much of a hassle at all. The worst there is probably getting up to Area 5, which can be a little bit of a pain in the ass, because most of the regions that lead up to that nest have a lot of climbing involved, but that's really kind of the only annoying part about maneuvering this location. The highs of the Ancestral Steppe are enormously high, but the outstanding aspects are just a little bit inconsistent. A number of zones don't get used enough, and there are plenty of areas that get more unique treatment from the art department. There's next to nothing here that's actually bad, just a noticeable chunk that's kinda average and a little underserved. At its absolute best though, some of the greatest views and combat that Monster Hunter has to offer can be found here. Number 6. Monster Hunter tries Volcano. I said this a few months ago when I made that video about what maps I would like to see remade in a modern style. Monster Hunter tries Volcano is about 15 years old, and it's still the best volcano map they've ever made. I love this place. Remember when I complimented the Citadel and its art direction's ability to transition from one biome type to another? Well, I think Tries Volcano is the undisputed master of this. There's been a few maps in Monster Hunter where you start at the base of a mountain and have to ascend to its peak to get to the really dangerous monsters. This volcano has better pacing, traversal, art progression, and monster placement than pretty much all of them. Your base camp is placed on top of this little overlook that can observe the volcano and the region at its feet. The mountain of fire towers over absolutely everything, taking up damn near the whole screen, even from this distance. The skies are completely blotted out by smoke and ash, and lava rains from the sky. The presence of this behemoth is absolutely tremendous and sets such a fantastic tone for the upcoming battles. It's almost like the region around this volcano is shrouded in an endless night from all the smoke clouds being kicked up. It will take you a little bit to get to the mountain though. There are 2 sets of zones for you to move through before entering. Areas 1 and 2 are just far enough from the volcano that some greenery and a few species of herbivores can still safely exist out here. Most of the trees are dead, but grass and a few shrubs still remain. I like these areas a lot, just because they're so different from a normal volcano map. There's almost never any greenery on any other locale like this. It's usually just rocky gray wasteland, followed up by rocky gray lava-infested hellscape. These grassy sections flesh out the area around the volcano a little bit, allowing for some different life to exist on this map, and showing off just how tremendous the effects of this one volcano are. Areas 3 and 4 are right at the base of the volcano, and serve as the lead-up before you enter the Caverns of Fire. The plant life here is mostly dead, and the herbivores stay away for the most part. It's the barren calm before the storm. Then areas 6 and 7 bring you into the heart of the mountain, letting you wander in these gigantic caverns that are lit up by lava. Areas 5 and 8 are these open-air platforms found alongside the volcano and closer to its summit, granting maneuverability to aerial predators. Area 9 is this shoddy, narrow pathway that snakes around the top of the volcano that leads to Area 10, which is this nest located right in the volcano's mouth. These zones look awesome as well, by the way. The volcano is built up so well by being visible from 5 other zones, and entering this place does not disappoint. The entire volcano is lit up by these giant lakes of fire. The ground is this kind of nice looking brown and red coloration to brighten up the place a teeny bit. The background for 8 is just so damn cool, dude. You're in this big open air platform kind of near to the top of the mountain, fighting some giant wyvern or something, and there's just this tsunami of magma descending from the mountain only feet away from you, and it seems to just stretch on forever. The nest at the summit is sick too. You're surrounded by these ceaseless geysers of magma while you're trying to put down an Ignactor or a Rathalos once and for all. Fighting here is just awesome. I adore the journey this pathway takes you on. The trek from the outskirts of this volcanic valley into the very core of the mountain and up to its summit. It's very gradual, but it's not meandering. It takes the perfect amount of time getting where it needs to go. What I think makes this map so satisfying to traverse is a few things. It's really just 2 lanes with a zone or 2 in the middle that eventually can join, so maneuvering through this place is super simple. There's no obnoxious spamming of wall climbing sections to get to the top of the map. It's just normal running. And the non-volcano zones are pretty small, so if you faint, you're probably going to be back in the volcano in less than a minute. There is so much less time wasted here than, say, Monster Hunter DOS's Arctic Ridge. I think the simple layout and movement lend themselves really well to such a linear map design. And one reason I think I prefer this art progression over the ancestral step is because the map only gets cooler to look at the deeper you go in. Climbing the mountain brings you towards the awesome colors in Skybox, not away from them. Combat here is really sick too. I think some of the most innovative monster and map synergy from the 3rd generation can be found here. Area 7 is built for Ignactor. It's a gigantic cave for him to leap around, to dive from floor to ceiling, and to show off his incredible burrowing abilities. There's also these decently placed little lava pools on the edges of the map that make it easier for him to reignite his magma armor. Area 6 is one gigantic half-pipe built exclusively for Uragan's rolling attack. He can roll wherever he goes, sure, but now he's zooming up walls and crashing down on your head, and it's just a blast to watch. Areas 5 and 8 have these open skies and tons of room for Rathalos to swoop around and attack from the air, and all of these zones are perfectly solid enough that they're still fun even without that specific monster that they had in mind present. I can't think of a map in Monster Hunter from Tri or before with this many zones crafted to amplify the abilities of the monsters that the map was made for. I think this is an awesome precursor for what we'd eventually see in Monster Hunter 4 and the games after that. There are some really sick innovations here. On top of that, the zones that lead up to the volcano aren't just useless travel zones. Granted, they're still used less than the normal volcano sections, but that's pretty fair. The volcano sections are the main attraction. Monster Hunter Portable 3rd and 3 Ultimate were particularly nice to these 4 zones, though. In Tri, you might see Rathalos and Deviljho occasionally hunting in these grassy regions, and Uragon could enter the rocky wastelands of 3 and 4 once in a while, but in Tri's follow-ups, monsters like Brute Tigrex, Crimson Qurupeco, Volvodon, and Great Roggy can be fought here as well, giving these prelude battle zones a lot more legitimacy. The music for this map is pretty sick. It's another track that's very rhythm-driven. The percussion is insanely strong, and right out the gate it hits you with this loud, aggressive, clacking type of sound that makes this track a super sick character theme for Ignactor. They've even got this low-tuned electric guitar that plays in the background every once in a while. That sounds really good. I will say the more percussion-heavy parts are definitely my favorites. Not that any part of it is bad. The horn sections have some good build and intense anxiety to them. Just what they play doesn't really hook me for whatever reason. However, there is this cool instrument in here that I don't exactly recognize. I'm guessing it's some kind of woodwind, and it gets a few isolated parts here and there. There's something almost kinda, I guess maybe serpentine to how it sounds, which also fits for Ignactor. It's kinda quiet and reserved and a little charming, but it's also creepy and dangerous. Yeah, man, this map rocks. It gets a couple of points off for its really linear design, even though I think it executes that concept about as well as you can. Those 4 front zones, though not worthless, could benefit from a little extra flushing out, and there's stuff that I really like about the music, but I don't absolutely adore the whole piece front to back. Those are a couple of small gripes, though. I'm getting to the point where I really have to try to be bothered by something about these maps so that I can actually stack them against one another. But the tailoring of several zones to the combat styles of specific monsters makes this map pretty revolutionary for its time. Every zone is really fun to fight in, regardless of those details. The journey is excellent. The art is absolutely incredible. I don't know if they'll ever do a volcano map better than this. Number 5, the Misty Peaks. The Shrine Ruins was far from the first map to try and tackle a Japanese-inspired forest-type locale. Wasn't the best to do it either. Hailing from Monster Hunter Portable 3rd and then continuing on through Tri Ultimate and Generations, we have the absolutely gorgeous Misty Peaks. Though the Ancestral Steppe has the biggest and boldest autumnal colors, the Misty Peak did it first. And Tri's Volcano may have a magnificently crafted sense of progression with its art, but the Misty Peaks goes for full-on beauty. To this day, years and years after its creation, I'd say the Misty Peaks still ranks amongst the prettiest maps in all of Monster Hunter. Top 5, maybe even top 3 on that list. And it's not just the foliage that's beautiful, it's everything. The caves have this glittering golden glow to them. The mountaintops never lose their verdancy completely. The bright blue sky has these waves of clouds moving across it, which allows for the sun's rays to come pouring in at certain locations. The water is a nice crystalline coloration. The rocks use lighter grays to keep the place feeling bright and alive. There's this great mixture of long grasses, bamboo stalks, shrubs, large deciduous trees, and massive other trees with twisted and curved trunks. Some of the backgrounds here are awesome too. I love the huge stones that dot the landscape, some of them having trees and grasses growing on top of them. The wind sweeps through the valleys that these giant stone pillars inhabit and carries the titular mist through the region. This fog wraps around the entire map, giving it an ancient and mystifying personality. I will circle back to the trees though, because I think they do something super cool here. The shading and color blending for the trees in the Misty Peaks, as well as the varied application of those factors, is amazing. The majority of the trees keep their very lush, deep greens. Some of them, however, have leaves that start to turn to those yellow and orange fall colors as they get further from the trunk. What's awesome is they keep those levels of coloration difference between individual trees. Some are almost fully dominated by autumn colors. Others have the first little creeping shades of yellow and orange just beginning to manifest. Some map zones have a ton of the yellow and orange. Others have very little. And what this does is turn the Misty Peaks into this kind of of snapshot in time, this moment where autumn is just beginning to take hold in this region. Its influence is a bit stronger in certain areas than it is in others, but it hasn't fully set in just yet. And the quality of the blending of all these colors makes it so that all this different stuff going on doesn't feel abrupt or clunky or distracting or messy. An absolute mountain of work and thought clearly went into the art here. And wouldn't you know it, the travel and the combat in these zones is all pretty fantastic too. It's not a particularly massive map, boasting only 9 zones, and you have some excellent traversal hubs, those being 2, 4, 6, 7, and 9. Almost every zone in the Misty Peaks is within 2 loading screens of every other zone on the map. Moving around here and tracking monsters is incredibly easy. Don't really have any complaints about the fighting either. I don't think there's any really bad zones here. If I'm being harsh though, the Misty Peaks doesn't really break any ground in terms of combat. I like battle zones here because they're nice and spacious with some excellent artwork. Area 6 is a gorgeous centerpiece for the entirety of the Misty Peaks. It's a water-filled battleground fed by a nearby waterfall with huge overhanging tree branches filled with those yellow and orange colors, all while some of those leaves are blowing around in the wind. Love fighting there. 7's a solid zone too. It's a kind of marshy wetland area right next to the lake. You have a lot of tall reeds and grasses that can obscure your vision slightly. That's kind of cool. Area 5 is a nice dense woodland zone. I just wish it had some trees for monsters to smash into or something, especially since this zone usually features Dorambros throwing that giant wrecking ball of a tail around. Speaking of monsters, another great roster. It's got a nice grab bag of lower tier monsters like Great Jaggi and Arzuros, a bunch of aquatic monsters like Royal Ladroth and Plesioth, plenty of forest dwelling wyverns like Nargacuga and the Wraths, and some big bruisers like Deviljho and Doramboros. The core roster is pretty similar to the other watery 3rd generation forest maps, the Deserted Island and the Flooded Forest, so it's not the most unique group of monsters for 3rd generation, but there aren't really any complaints to be had here either. Though I will say the flagships made for the Misty Peaks do add some excellent personality and spice that a few other maps lack. The Misty Peaks was created to match the Japanese aesthetic of Monster Hunter Portable 3rd. It's a map built for its game. Zenogre, Portable 3rd's flagship, absolutely fits with the Misty Peaks very well. He is heavily inspired by the mythological Thunderwolf Raiju of Japanese folklore after all. He looks pretty exceptional at night, all lit up with lightning and hunting amongst the misty woods, but the Misty Peaks received its true ruler a few years later. Monster Hunter Generations Mizutsune is the Misty Peaks. It embodies the Japanese aesthetic, the gorgeous colors, the watery nature, the grace, the beauty, and illustriousness of its home perfectly. Few monsters come anywhere close to personifying their homeland as well as Mizutsune does for the Misty Peaks. And the music here is great as well. Fittingly, it is very Japanese in its instrumentation. The star of the show is the flute player. They set the mysterious and ancestral tone beautifully. I think they very cleverly use percussion backed by lower horns for the driving rhythm. They let the prettier sounding flute and strings take the starring roles and make the track sound very pleasant to listen to, whilst then adding a little extra tension, depth, fattiness, and fight pacing that a battle track still needs. I think the composer did a very good job balancing things so that the more aggressive musical elements aren't sacrificed, and yet the piece can still have its more gorgeous elements up in the forefront. This map is amazing, borderline flawless. If it wasn't for the fact that it isn't all that innovative and lacks some of the incredibly well executed complexities of the 5th, 4th, and a few of the 3rd generation locales, I think we would be seeing the Misty Peaks being a potential top 3 contender. That's the worst I can say about this map, really. It's pretty safe in a few places, given the context of its era. It's kinda it. Number 4, the Wildspire Wastes. This one a hot take? I'm actually kinda not sure. I don't see this map get talked about quite as much as I think it deserves to be. Personally, I think the Wildspire Waste rules. Yeah, it's kinda the token desert map of Monster Hunter World, but it's way more than that. Way more than kinda any other desert map in Monster Hunter, honestly. It's a desert, and a miniature forest, and a swamp, and a canyon map with caves all over it, all at once, and it doesn't feel lazy or slapped together or cluttered at all. I actually think it's kind of ingenious how they pulled this off. See, the Wildspire Waste is indeed located in a dried out and arid part of the continent, but geographically, it's close enough to the more humid regions of the New World that house the ancient forest that some rivers of water from that area have flowed here. The river that has flowed into the Wildspire Waste is the entity that gives this map its entire structure. Buckle up, we're going to be talking about art direction and progression for the 47th time on this list. This might be the best one though. I love the CR-Volcano, but this one's really, really sick. So if you go looking, you can actually find the point where the water flows from the foresty regions off a cliff, forms a waterfall, creates a watering hole, and that water eventually carved out a second river which cut through the rocky walls of this place, spilled down into a huge flatland of dirt and grime, formed a massive marshy wetlands, and then that spills down some extra hills, and that water then forms these big muddy bogs. There's an advantage to the classic Monster Hunter maps where they can use the fact that they're broken up into loading zones to create these big shifts in terrain and art style between the areas. They can create a lot of distance without needing to explore that distance itself. They don't have to communicate every singular inch of a region's change, just showcase the major bullet points. This gives the modern seamless 5th generation maps a bit of a challenge when they want to create shifts in their atmosphere and surroundings. That's because their overall size is far more limited and they have to show you every single tiny change. So when a seamless locale can change up its environments this well, it's really damn impressive. And the Wildspire Waste is really damn impressive. It's the fact that you have this one singular landmark, this river, which flows from a different locale, and the fact that this river carves and redefines and fleshes out and gives life to so many components of this one other map is so excellent. And then if you go a little north into the region where the river has no providence, you're gonna get to the really cool big chunks of dried out classic desert maps that you can go fight on. And then how is the fighting? It's excellent. There's maybe 2 zones that are mildly annoying every once in a while. Area 3 is part of the forest region. It's a little small, has a lot of slopes, only has 2 ways out. It has a number of pretty easy to hit plants that can spill poison onto the ground. It's not impossible to get corner trapped here, and some monsters like Glavenus and Deviljho just feel a little bit too large to fight comfortably. There's also Area 7, which is a super skinny little zone that's tucked right in the middle of a canyon. That one sits between the marshes and the desert. It's not uncommon to be batted into one of the small hallways here and then comboed to death. The other thing about this zone is that it's a super popular travel route for monsters to use, so you will very often be fighting something in this narrow little canyon, only to have another monster muscle their way into the fight, and now you're stuck in that narrow little canyon with 2 monsters, and this happens a ton. It's not the worst thing in the world though. These areas are just somewhat annoying with a moderate degree of consistency. A lot of these zones are nice and spacious with some fun elements to fight on and around though. I really enjoy the huge open marshlands of Area 4. There's a lot of breathing room here, which is great because this is another area where monsters tend to enjoy assembling. It's far more manageable with this amount of space though. There's a whole bunch of small rock platforms you can hop off for mounting attacks. There's a few scattered paratoads you can use here. I like the mix of muddy water, rocky terrain, and long wild grasses and flowers. It's got an aesthetic I enjoy a ton. I do like the deeper bogs of 9 and 10, which slow down your movement, but not to a painful degree, and they use the new shallow water mechanics to allow Gyrototus to actually fight like an aquatic monster, despite the lack of underwater combat in the game. These zones have some rocks and wedge beetles that you can use for better traversal, and encourage the use of the waterproof mantle for uninhibited movement. Area 1 is the main forest region here. It's a nice shady area for some of the less heat-resistant monsters to use. It has a few well-placed ledges for combat, some large trees that serve as minor obstacles, and is decently well-sized. It's another zone like the marshes that helps keep the Wildspire Waste feel varied. Area 8 is your big, fat, open desert zone. Once again, very spacious, great for fights like Glavenus, Teostra, and Diablos. It keeps itself interesting to fight on by being covered in sloping dunes and destructible spires. These give you lots of vertical attack windows and keep the place visually engaging. Directly under this big desert is a huge underground cavern, which is a perfectly good battle zone as well. However, it's the reason for one of the coolest interactions in all of Monster Hunter. If there is a Diablos down in these caverns, and you manage to agitate the Noyos wing drakes up above ground, they will shriek. Then shrieking will enrage the Diablos. He'll come shooting up out of the ground, and if you and the monster are fighting close enough to his exit point, you'll get dragged down into the caverns from this pit that Diablos created. Then Diablos will dig back down and attack you all. Speaking of Diablos being down here, Area 14 is Diablos' nest and has a sick special interaction where there are these effectively sand waterfalls that Diablos can burrow into and out of for horizontal digging attacks that he's never been able to do in previous games. There's also Area 6, which I adore. This is another absolutely massive zone, about as large as the Marshlands, but with way more stuff. It's got several raised platforms at varying elevations, there's rocky bridges and large rock walls that you can use to rain down aerial attacks on monsters, there's armored herds of Apsaros that you might need to contend with, there's the constant threat of being flung off the large cliffs. It's an incredibly dynamic battle zone with just a ton of interactable stuff to play around with. I think battling here is an absolute ton of fun. The music is pretty damn good too. It kinda somehow feels relaxed and atmospheric while also being a decent fight track with some good energy. It's got a pretty slow tempo and a number of sections which usually occur right after the big blaring brass chunks where they kind of quiet things down considerably and limit the instrumentation. These chunks can sometimes feel more like a desert wasteland ambient track instead of like a battles track, but I do like it musically. There's some cool lower brass that sounds nice and fat and makes the monsters you're fighting feel a little bit bigger and heavier. We've got yet another flute soloist here, which I'm definitely not sick of hearing, but I'm just now noticing how much Monster Hunter really likes to use this. There's a particular part right towards the end of the music loop that I love, where they use that flute solo, take that to build into a nice big climactic battlefield with all the horns and strings playing nice and loud, and then they sharply cut that down into this fun bit where they have the percussion, the low horns, and the strings play this cool rhythm in sync, while they then kind of spice up the edges of the track a little bit with some mixed percussion in there. There's a great amount of instrument choice tossed in along with your more conventional orchestra, and it makes for a super enjoyable piece of music that doesn't always work as the best battle track. This map is awesome. It's so much more than just a desert map. It's got all these elements from different kinds of biomes expertly blended and slotted together to make this vibrant ecosystem in a way that's sensible. I think this is some of the best locale diversity on an individual map that Monster Hunter has to offer. It's got a few battle zones that tailor to the abilities of its monsters. It has a large bestiary of awesome creatures that cover multiple monster type and levels of strength. It's got a fun soundtrack, some pretty awesome battle zones, and it's just a map that I always really enjoy loading into and just running around on. Its map theme has a few parts that drop a lot of the tension. It has one or two zones that are only okay, and the narrow canyon pathways can occasionally result in monster traffic jams, but these are pretty forgivable gripes for a map with excellent combats and a fantastic retooling of the classic desert map archetype that masterfully displays the strengths of seamless locale design at a level that none of its contemporaries could compete with. Number 3, The Deserted Island. True quality or pure nostalgia for this one? Why not a little bit of both? The Deserted Island is a very special locale for a lot of people. The opening of Monster Hunter Tri, which was an entry point for many hunters, including myself, and the map that brought underwater combat into Monster Hunter. It's also proudly featured in Monster Hunter Generations. I'm incredibly familiar with this place. I started out here. I spent hours and hours in the trees and in the oceans and on the cliffs hunting monsters for fun. I love this endearing chunk of monster hunting island paradise. Maybe there's a little bit of bias here, but I do think the deserted island is pretty damn special. They do a really good job with making every zone on the deserted island feel unique from one another, whilst having every zone transition feel sensible. There's no instances where you leave a zone, pop out in another one, and it feels like you just kind of warped to a random location. Even some of these other very excellent classic style Monster Hunter maps with great art progression don't always do the best job communicating how one area leads into another. For example, you start in area 1. It has this big, beautiful overlook view of the entire island. If you look right, the path guides you downhill towards the ocean. If you look left, the path keeps you at a higher elevation and moves you towards the mountains and the forests. You go left, area 3 has a dense canopy of tree leaves, and the back wall of the zone is partially composed of the sides of the mountain, with caverns leading in different directions. There's also another pathway that leads back downhill towards the ocean again. If you keep going left, then you'll end up in a kind of open air cavern cut into the mountain, where you can find pathways that will either lead deeper into the core of the mountains, or they'll guide you up towards the cliffs that oversee the ocean. Then you go up onto those cliffs and you jump off of them, well then you land in the ocean. Alternatively, if you decide to head to the right and downhill, the zones will gradually start to get more and more wide open. You'll get larger and larger pockets of water as you get closer to the ocean, which is kind of spilling up onto the ground. Eventually, large parts of the zones will be fully flooded. You'll hit the coast, and then it's a few zones of just open ocean. And then if you look up to the left, you can see the cliffs and the mountains that make up the left side of the map that you can go to. There's some very solid work done here in making every singular battle zone feel unique and distinct, while also using art and height changes and backgrounds to expertly communicate what the next zone is going to look like and where everything is in relation to each other. There's lots of great, natural, sensible transitions while still making use of grasslands and coasts and oceans and caves and forests and cliffs. I think that deserves a lot of recognition. Speaking of the art direction, the deserted island is pretty lucky that it stuck around for a couple of games. Tri had a fairly washed out color palette, which Tri Ultimate and then Generations helped to flesh out a lot. The colors here are a lot like DOS's jungles. Nothing too groundbreaking, but there's plenty of incredibly pleasant greens and bright blues with lighter grays and browns mixed in. Not a set of colors you've never seen before, but they're perfectly well executed. There's some solid lighting on this map as well. The overhanging trees and huge looming mountain walls give zones like 3, 6, 4, and 8 a lot more foreboding to them. Gives the map kind of a neat dichotomy. You have the more intimidating upper half of the map that sits in the shadow of the mountains, and then you have the big, wide, and sunny lower sections that feel a little bit more relaxed and good-spirited and seaside-y. Speaking of menacing lighting, I think they did an excellent job making the underwater sections of the map feel dark and isolating, without obscuring your vision so much with the water that it gets annoying to actually see down here. They also bathe everything in a nice deep layer of blue to sell the feeling of actually being underwater. Once again though, it's not too much. You can still see all the individual colors of everything. The underwater sections are bright enough that the large monsters down here can have these big looming dark silhouettes that kind of add a layer of fear to these submerged encounters, and it's also dark enough down here that glowing features like Legiacris's eyes and lightning get some extra level of luminescence to them. The team absolutely nailed the underwater aesthetics of this map. And then these underwater sections are one of two reasons why the deserted island is also a historically extremely relevant map for Monster Hunter. Three-dimensional movement and combat has become incredibly important for the series as a whole. I've talked about it a ton in these videos. This is pretty much where Leviathan monsters, jumping attacks, mounts, aerial styles, shallow water duels, and wirebugs got their start. There was a player interest in exploring bodies of water like the rivers and the forest and hills back in the older Monster Hunter games, so the developers crafted this huge deserted island and dedicated several zones to building up the presence of the ocean and then allowing you to delve into those seas yourself. One of the single most iconic monsters of all time, the Legiacris, was then created alongside this island mechanic. The legacy of the deserted island is also defined by the fact that it is the first map in Monster Hunter that you can enter completely for fun with zero quest restrictions. No time limit, no set target monster, you can just hunt to your heart's content. The entire monster roster of the deserted island could randomly spawn, and you could choose to face them at your discretion or avoid them entirely and just go gathering. Sure, there were pass delivery quests in previous Monster Hunter games that were very lightly restricted quests that were mostly meant for gathering items, but but the free hunting that the deserted island allowed for tossed out those restrictions entirely. This choice set the precedent for expeditions in Monster Hunter World and Rise, and Monster Hunter Wilds will be an entire game based on loose quest structures and freely hunting whatever you choose. These mechanics may give the deserted island a bit of an unfair advantage over its contemporaries. These aspects of gameplay could very well have been implemented whether or not the deserted island was the deserted island, but some credit has to be given here. This may very well be the most important map in the series history. A ton of what Monster Hunter is nowadays really kind of starts here. Many of these other maps we've talked about are incredibly revolutionary for their role in overall locale design for Monster Hunter, but the deserted island was revolutionary for the franchise as a whole. I will say, though the Mogo Woods free hunting mechanic is amazing and game-changing, it allowed for some weird monsters to show up on this map for this game mode specifically. A bunch of high-rank monsters who have no business being on a forest island can just show up in this mode, but only in Tri-Ultimate. In Tri and in Generations, the bestiary of the deserted island is composed of forest-dwelling beasts like Arzuros and Zenogre, cliff-ascending flying wyverns like the Wraths and Malfestio, coast-dwellers like Ludroth and Hermitar, as well as larger sea monsters like Plesioth and Lagiacrus. That's all perfectly sensible. But man, Tri-Ultimate lets you fight things like Uragan, Diablos, Brachydios, and Baroth out here. I'm guessing what the developers wanted was for you to be able to free hunt more monsters and collect more resources from them in this particular game mode, but they didn't have time to program some of the other maps to have the random monsters spawning and ditch the quest restrictions there. I didn't mark this map down a ton of points for its monster variety because of the context of the Mogo Woods game mode, but man, there are some weird choices put here. Speaking of monsters, fighting here feels pretty good. As I stated earlier, the zones have a decent mixture of different styles and backgrounds, so it's a map that doesn't get boring to fight on. There's only one zone that's only okay, it's just the narrow hallway section of Area 3. Honestly, I don't even find myself getting pushed into that hallway a ton anyways. I enjoy the scenic battles on top of the cliffs at Area 8. Areas 2 and 5 are these nice, big, spacious, open-air zones with a lot of flexibility for you and the monsters. Area 6 is a pretty cool boxed-in nest where you'll often be swarmed by jaggies. Underwater combat itself can be controversial, but I like the zones it's featured in. They're properly enormous, which lets Lagiacrus show off how maneuverable he is. Zone 10 even has some huge underwater ruined pillars for him to smash into. The other cool thing about the deserted island is that it's an absolutely gargantuan map boasting 12 zones, and not only do all those zones get used for combat, but they see combat very consistently. There's not a ton of favoritism here. I have distinct memories about fighting monsters all over this place pretty consistently. I think this is extra cool considering the fact that every zone has its own kind of biome and art style to it. So you can just get an absolute ton of variety of monsters and art style and locations and arrangements and all that kind of stuff when you go hunting on the deserted island regularly, and I think that's kind of sick. I'll finish things off with the music. It is a pretty iconic track and a really good character theme for Lagiacrus. Right from the get-go, it starts off with an aggressively attention-grabbing blast of sound that moves into a harsh battle version of the Monster Hunter Tri theme for a few notes. Even in its quieter segments, this piece feels huge and aggressive. The percussion is enormously heavy, and there are multiple massive swells of horns and strings that build into these blaring trumpet fanfares. Now, this is a battle track. It never lets go of you or the intensity. It just keeps driving non-stop with its fast tempo and enormous sound. It's almost a bit too intense for some of the lower tier monsters. Those trumpet crescendos especially have a very kingly feel to them and perfectly fit for a battle with a Lagiacrus. Definitely one of my favorite map themes of all time. Monster Hunter owes a lot of its identity to the deserted island. It's an insanely good map to owe that kind of debt to, by the way. It's awesome to explore, executes a simple art concept incredibly well, pioneered and retooled several major Monster Hunter mechanics, has a fantastic fight theme, and makes excellent use of its gargantuan arena. Sometimes the things you're nostalgic for are actually just that good. Number 2, Monster Hunter Rise's Sandy Plains. When I make lists like these, I'm always hoping that I can get in some kind of a surprise sleeper pick just really high up on the list. I am certainly no contrarian for the sake of being a contrarian, but having a hot take and propping up an underdog can be pretty damn fun. I talked up the Wildspire Wastes a lot 2 entries ago, so how in the world does that map get beat out by a more standard issue desert biome that's a remake of a classic map? Because this is a masterfully done remake of an already phenomenal map that matches perfectly with the gameplay and seamlessness of the game it was remade for. And it has, in my opinion, the single greatest locale battle theme in mainline Monster Hunter. Let me explain. The biggest thing here is this particular map's status as a remake of the Sandy Plains from Monster Hunter Tri. A point or two for originality has to be docked for that fact. But I think that almost completely gets overturned by how good this map fits specifically within Monster Hunter Rise. A major issue that plagues the original desert maps of Monster Hunter is that the major desert battle zones were absolutely gigantic, placed right in the middle of things, and had loading zones at large distances away, and took a long time to cross sometimes. Now, the original Sandy Plains had a decent fix to this issue. It tucked the huge desert chunks away off to the left edge of the map so that they were less impactful on travel between the other zones. Monster Hunter Rise benefits from this layout and improves on things even further with the use of wire bugs and the palamutes. Now, we still have our big wide open desert battle zones that capture the feeling of facing an opponent out in these enormous wastelands, but all travel issues are axed completely. No bad placement, no terrible travel speed, nothing. Being able to run up walls and the seamlessness of the map also eliminates a ton of the loading zone issues that older desert maps could have to deal with. All the benefits, none of the drawbacks. Speaking of that seamlessness, it completely reinvents the system of caves that lie below the plains. In the original Sandy Plains, there's a series of caverns, sometimes used as battle zones and as nests. They're pretty lightly used in combat on the original map, though. In the Rise version, however, they are huge components of the map, super easily accessible, and look way cooler. There are lots of chasms and drop-offs scattered around Rise's Sandy Plains that you can leap off of to just go straight down to the bottom regions of the place. This simplicity of traversal means that they stepped out the amount of time that monsters will go down here considerably, and the fight variety of the Sandy Plains is all the better for it. In fact, battle zone usage gets benefited almost everywhere in this version of the Sandy Plains. The original version of the map is a gigantic locale that has some fairly uneven zone usage. I can remember fighting in zones 1 and 2 occasionally. The caves of 7 and 11 were utilized every once in a while. Zone 5 wasn't used for that much more than a nest. The Rise Sandy Plains distributes its monsters amongst the zones so well that it could add 2 more completely new battle arenas, and the place still entirely feels properly used. I said earlier that the caverns were used a hell of a lot more. Area 5 and 11 aren't just regulated to being nest zones anymore either. I love what they did with areas 1 and 2. They kept their higher elevation over much of the rest of the map and let a lot more monsters come up onto these elevated regions, which gives you this cool kind of scenic view to battle on, whilst the nature of Rise allows monsters to knock you off of cliffs, which I often find fun. I have had numerous fights up here where I caught myself being flung off of a ledge or used a wire bug to propel myself up and over gaps the monsters and I were fighting on. Area 3 is a brand new lower region that replaced some of the old scenic views that you could get from the elevated tops of Zone 1 in Tri's rendition of this map. It does suck a bit to lose some of the cool backdrops of this place, but the return for it is a solid box of an arena that is properly spaced but also sealed in on all sides by walls. It can make for a pretty good intimate battle zone that isn't oppressive but can be tough to run away from if you're getting caught up in there. And the brand new Area 5 is a much welcome new watering hole. This is undoubtedly created to give Almadron a second muddy swamp to go fight in. I enjoy these two additions a lot. They diversify the scenery of the Sandy Plains and battle zone structure of the place a decent bit, while filling in a couple of gaps that would exist from making the original Sandy Plains seamless. The art direction here is perfectly fine. The desert uses some good blends of tans, browns, and grays with a little bit of orange and yellow mixed in to color most of the map. I would have liked a little bit more saturation in the sand here, but that is an overarching issue with Rise itself, and the color blending here makes it so that the desert zones still look pretty good. They aren't just big, flat, tan circles. There's an appropriate amount of green scrub and small trees scattered around the place to saturate things with green a little bit more. It's nothing too overbearing, but it makes for some extra good detailing. The watering holes have a similar effect, adding a healthy amount of blue to the place, which makes me extra happy that we got a second zone like this now. There's some great lighting in the skybox as well. The sunset just floods the entire place with a nice bright orange, which I think looks excellent and makes the map as colorful as I like it to be the entire time. And the super clean Starry Night skybox is pretty gorgeous too. I do appreciate the extra spattering of ancient worn out ruins in this place that aren't nearly as present in the original version of this map as well. A lot of this is found in the areas between the battle zones. It gives the place a little bit more history as well as cool scenery. The best example of this is down in the caverns of Area 11. They created a few shelves of rock that ring around the more enclosed battle arena, and then built into the walls of the cave are several broken remains of brick buildings and a few old man-made passageways that you can explore. It grants this once incredibly underused battle zone a sort of underground coliseum or amphitheater type of feel to it, which is really sick. Some other zones I particularly enjoy here include the watering holes at Area 5 and 7. They add a nice change of scenery, some endemic life to use in battle, and a few large rocks to dodge around. The big desert zones 9 and 10 are nice and fun to fight in, as they provide a giant battlefield with minimal impediment and full range of movement for you and the monsters. The height and scenery make 1 and 2 feel pretty fun to fight on. 6 is a huge spacious hub zone that might often see multiple monsters enter the battle. Area 8 is kind of sick because it's got those 2 giant anthill towers that you can leap onto and swing off of and have monsters smash through. I like all of them. I don't think there is a single bad battle zone here. There's more impressive ones in this series with more verticality mechanics implemented, yeah, sure. But Rise is a game that declutters its zones to allow for more movement-intensive battles with the Palamutes and the Wirebugs. For what Rise is, these zones are pretty much unanimously great. There's nothing too small or too narrow or too cluttered. There's a good range of diverse zones despite the more uniform desert biome. You've got caves and deserts and watering holes and canyons and high-up cliffs and low-indented arenas, and it's a huge map that uses its entire enormous monster roster to make use of all of its space incredibly efficiently. Nothing on this map annoys me. There's nowhere here that I dislike going. I genuinely have an absolute blast when I hunt here. And the music, dude, it's so damn good. Like I said at the top, probably the best locale theme in mainline Monster Hunter. If we're counting Frontier, it's probably still top 10. Frontier's kind of unfair like that. Mercifully, this is not a remake of the originally Sandy Plains theme from Tri. The Flooded Forest and Jungle maps here that are also remakes did get their music completely remade, and those versions are woefully inferior compared to the original songs. And the original Sandy Plains piece was spared this fate. For some reason, the entire original track was just tossed out and replaced with this energetic, adventurous, grandiose track. It's not all that imposing or tension-filled or intense, it's just wicked fun. It keeps the percussion pretty fast and light. It has a beautiful arrangement of strings and horns with some flute acoustic strings mixed in there for a little bit of extra flavor. The star of the show is absolutely this female vocalist, though. She sounds phenomenal throughout the entire track with a lot of long, drawn-out notes that kind of adds this enchanting atmosphere to the piece. She's got a few segments in the song before the pace kind of slows down to feature the brass and the strings. Then they build back up into this incredible section where the whole orchestra, her included, get to kind of just go nuts. It's a blast to listen to. It's fantastical, has a kind of Arabian Nights feel that matches the desert aesthetic perfectly. It's got a great energy and pace to it. It's one of the most positive and upbeat battle tracks that Monster Hunter has to offer, which makes it just stand out to me even more. I think this map might be borderline flawless. It's a tad odd that something like a Basarios or a Kashaladora can be fought here. I think the map and Rise as a whole could have been benefited from some slight saturation bump, but like it's kind of it, and it's not the most unique thing in the world just because it can't be because it's a remake. I love all the battle zones. I adore the music. The monster roster is a ton of fun. It makes excellent use of its enormous size. Moving around isn't a hassle in the slightest. I don't have any complaints. I love being here. I love fighting here. Love just running around the place and exploring it. I think it's exceptional, and it's such a well-selected map for a remake that's incredibly well executed. The movement options and seamlessness of the zones that Rise provides were a net positive for some areas of the Sandy Plains that went underused or weren't as fun to trek through on that original map. It makes better use of the zones than the original map did and added 2 great new ones. Remaking the Sandy Plains for Monster Hunter Rise was a perfect decision. It fits this game beautifully and was almost exclusively additive to the original map. Only a few great backgrounds were sacrificed, which was a worthy price to pay for one of the most exhilarating hunting grounds ever constructed. Number 1. The Hoarfrost Reach. Monster Hunter World Iceborne's star attraction is the titanic, the gorgeous, the pristine beauty of a location known as the Hoarfrost Reach. This locale is a bona fide winter wonderland, absolutely coated in ice and snow. Yeah, sure, it's a bit of a uniform color palette, but the enormous blanket of the white snow contrasted with the harsh dark gray stone, an excellent mixture of blues and violets for the ice, just makes the entire place look phenomenal. And the way the light reflects off the snow and ice here is just so well done. It's a little tough to actually talk about the color palette for this map because it's like I said, it's pretty uniform. It's just so well executed that it doesn't really matter so much that the locale shares a lot of the same coloration. The lighting, the color blending, and contrast of the snow against the ice and the rock does a lot of work just making the whole place feel incredibly gorgeous. There's some progression worth mentioning. Again, it's not the most dramatically wild example that we've had on this list. It's just really good. You start in a dense Arctic forest that thins out as the map's elevation increases. Eventually, things just kind of open up into broader snowfields and icy mesas that are out overlooking the ocean. And then as you get higher, the map starts to be populated more with mountains, which results in caverns that can be delved to and even higher altitude mesas that can be ascended up to. And sequestered off in its own little corner is the more fantastical Volcano nest. It's not a full-on trek up an entire snowy mountain like another map did. It's more like a casual hike right up to the base of a snowy mountain. Like the colors, it doesn't really sound super dramatic and incredible to spell out how the Hoarfrost Reach's art progression works. You kind of just gotta go there to get it. The Hoarfrost Reach is captivating, enthralling. More than many other places we listed here, I think it kind of takes a bit of a less is more approach. The map isn't trying to be a whole bunch of things at once, which, as we saw with the Wildspire Waste, is certainly not a bad thing, but it's trying to maximize one singular vision for a biome. That's what the Hoarfrost Reach excels at. This is possibly the largest Monster Hunter map pre-Wilds. It's fairly simple in its overarching art design, and yet it's not boring in the slightest. I think that's because of the details, the mechanics, and the sheer quality of the Reach's battle zones. This is where I think the Hoarfrost Reach absolutely shines, and why I think this is the best map in the entire series. Combat here is exceptional. There's like 16, 17 combat arenas in this place, and they're all good. Like all of them. Yeah, okay, the small icy lake in Area 15 can sometimes be a little annoying because certain monster attacks can create tremors in the shifting ice, but that's also kind of cool to fight on at the same time. Let's break down what's actually here. Area 1, 2, and 3 are various forested regions, each containing patches of deep snowdrifts that Beototas can use to swim around and attack from. Area 5 is a walled-in arena with one giant ledge that can be scaled for mounting attacks and verticality shifts. Area 4, big, fat, open snow zone with a huge drift in the middle that can be used for sliding attacks and a wall of loose snow that you can toss monsters into to create an avalanche and send them down into the caves. Area 6 is probably the widest, most open snow field in the entire map, with a few well-placed ledges, but otherwise minimal obstacles, which is great for monsters that just need to move around a lot. Area 7 is kind of weird. It seems to be cut up into 3 zones that aren't distinguished from one another. One is a cliff overlooking the ocean that has icy rivers that can give you ice blight if you stand in them for too long, and it also has these razor sharp rocks that monsters can be tossed into for some extra damage. Area 7 also has this other bigger, broader mesa that has several structurally weak ice platforms that can be knocked into the ocean by monster attacks. If you drop those platforms, you can potentially knock yourself down into the caverns, or you can give yourself a big opening on some of the monsters as they try to scramble out of that trap. And Area 7 also contains this kind of like claustrophobic but still really fun Barioth nest where he'll just jump and dive off the walls to attack you. Area 15 is that one I mentioned with the pond with the ice chunks floating around in it that can be turned into a tremor hazard. Area 13 has the Legiana nest, as well as a zone with numerous large hot springs that can cure ice blight and temporarily grant the effects of hot drinks. Areas 8, 9, 10, and 11 are all part of an interconnected cave system, with 10 being this huge cave that has air geysers that can knock you into the air. Area 8 is this much warmer cavern that is the point of origin for some of the hot springs that dot the upper level of the map. Area 9 is a much smaller cavern with these ice chunks that you can knock off the ceiling for extra damage. And then Area 16 is this almost unnatural looking throne of mangled, wiry ice sculptures that Volcano has carved out as its own nest. That's so much stuff on one map. Almost every single arena has some interesting mechanic or gimmick or interaction that you can play around with, and very few of those gimmicks repeat. And minus the occasional ice pond quake being annoying, they're all pretty damn fun. In fact, when I hunt on the Hoarfrost Reach, I usually try to fish for some of these interactions to happen, just because I like them, especially the avalanche and the ice structures collapsing. The variety and quality of both scenery and gameplay on display here is masterful, and once again, we have an utterly gigantic map that makes excellent use of all of its zones. Maybe 1 and 2 could get a little more love, as they're mostly reserved just for Bonboro and Beototas, and Area 8 doesn't see a ton of use from anything that isn't a Viper Toby Kadachi, but they do get their own mileage and are more specialized zones built for their specific monster's ecology. I have fought everywhere on this map tons of times and have enjoyed pretty close to every second of it. I don't think I've ever had a moment of, oh no, not this place. And one of the main reasons why this map is at the top of the list is because as good as world maps are, you're almost always gonna get a couple of zones that are too cluttered or too narrow or feel like a hallway that just kind of got fattened up a little bit and didn't really need to be there. I don't find that any of those exist here. Yeah, sure, some zones are a tad less exciting than others, but whatever. Also, for a reason that is kind of its own fault, the Hoarfrost Reach also has the best monster roster in Iceborne. This is because almost all of the invader monsters that dilute the monster rosters of every other map in the game were built for the Hoarfrost Reach. Bonboro, Fulgur Anjanath, and Velkhana were all made to be here, but the developers plopped them on every other map too. So that kind of makes the Hoarfrost Reach this kind of smug asshole of a map. It doesn't get out 100% scot-free though in its roster though. Kushala Daora should be on this map. It's really weird that he doesn't show up here, especially considering the fact that there's shed Kushala Daora skin up on top of the mountain. And I'll say it again, I do still want a Great Wool, Capcom. And of course, the music's also awesome. You got your standard issue, big, strong driving percussion, and you got your huge triumphant horn blasts and all that. And then they use strings and flutes and a piano and sleigh bells to just drench the entire track in this awesome wintry atmosphere that fits perfectly for fights on this map. It's a properly intense and fast-paced battle theme that fits for bigger monsters like Barioth and Legiana, whilst having an upbeat and fun winter adventure feeling, which makes it incredibly enjoyable as well as pretty fitting for the lower level monster fights. And that is what I believe to be the single greatest map in all of Monster Hunter. So far at least. It's enormous, masters its uniform art style, makes exceptional use of its gigantic list of battle zones, has the best roster of monsters in Iceborne, and has an incredibly fun fight track. It is extremely impressive how damn near flawless this map is. You can feel that the world development team truly mastered their craft when it came to locale design in Iceborne. There's so much room for this map to be dotted with mediocre elements, and it just wasn't. The worst thing I have to say about this is that some other maps are more artistically creative. So, how was the list? Did you enjoy yourselves this year? Hope you did. I love working on this project. If I missed a map that you love, you might want to check the honorable mentions video. This was a tough one. There's a lot of quality locales that couldn't make it onto the top 12, and making sure that I had a final order for my top 12 that I was actually happy with putting out was a pain. And there was an additional challenge in actually vocalizing why I thought specific maps were so good. Thank you for tuning into Merry Huntmas 2024. Now, the giving doesn't stop just yet. I got something dropping tomorrow on Christmas Day that I think you're going to want to watch. But until then, this has been CR-Volcanic, or Connor. I'll see you around. Shout out to all the patrons, and special shout out to Certified Rajang Hater, Dat Boy Doin Da Ding, Ketz, Lander Moon, Nihilist Chimerax, Peaberry, Psychotic Jester, Shaggy Grizzly, Sir Newt Newt, Stromlin, Call Sign Shadow, I Think I Stole Your Sandwich, Pecco Plush, and Sir SS Jacob. Thank you very much, everyone.